Welcome. You're listening to Detective Duo, bringing you tales from the golden age of mystery, adventures in the spirit of Tommy and Tuppence Beresford. Tap subscribe to stay with us and share where in the world you're listening from. It began, as many of their adventures did, with something quite ordinary refusing to remain so. Tuppence Beresford, having declared war on the household cupboards, stood surrounded by a small mountain of unwanted crockery and even less wanted dust. The afternoon light slanted through the sitting-room window in polite disapproval, illuminating her as if she were a general surveying the ruins of domestic battle. Somewhere behind her, a wireless murmured an agreeable waltz that neither inspired her nor improved her temper. "Tommy," she called sharply, "if I find one more chipped saucer pretending to be useful, I shall start a revolution." Her husband, from the armchair behind the Times, made a sound that might have been agreement or self-preservation. "My dear girl, revolutions are messy things. Why not an amnesty instead? Surrender the saucers peacefully." She glared at the rustling newspaper. "You'd let civilization collapse under the weight of chipped china." "I rather think civilization's managed worse." Tommy lowered the paper just in time to see the letterbox clatter. A single envelope slid onto the mat, gleaming against the faded carpet like a visiting card from fate itself. Tuppence pounced before he could move. "Gold edging. That's either a wedding or a summons." She sniffed. "No scent. So not from Mrs. Selden's dreadful niece." He watched her break the wax seal with an enthusiasm rarely reserved for bills. "Well," she read aloud, affecting grandeur. "Sir Reginald and Lady Langley request the pleasure of your company at a Halloween masquerade ball to be held at Langley Grange, Saturday the 29th of October. Theme, Masks and Mystery. A prize shall be awarded to the most successful solver of the evening's riddle." Tommy folded his newspaper. "Masks and Mystery. You realize that's practically bait for you." "Rubbish," said Tuppence briskly, though her eyes shone. "We're not going to be tempted into one of those country house spectacles where everyone behaves as if Agatha Christie were watching." "Exactly," Tommy replied. "So we shan't go." "Don't be absurd. Of course we're going." She sank into a chair, rereading the ornate handwriting. "Langley Grange. Doesn't that belong to the fellow with the racing horses and the tax problems?" "I believe so. And his wife, the one who collects exotic birds and social obligations." Tommy's tone implied equal suspicion of both. "We met them once before you decided to reorganize their charity raffle." Tuppence smiled reminiscently. "The raffle that raised £300 instead of 30. You'd think they'd be grateful." "They were, until you also exposed the treasurer's creative bookkeeping." "That was hardly my fault. Numbers simply behave oddly around dishonest people." She turned the envelope over, as if it might reveal a secret. "Still, a Halloween masquerade sounds delicious. I haven't worn a proper costume since we infiltrated that dreadful spy ring disguised as Austrian folk dancers." Tommy winced. "You promised never to speak of that incident again. My yodeling still haunts me." "Your yodeling haunted everyone." She reached for her notepad with the energy of a woman who has found her next project. "Costumes, then. I shall be a duchess, something with lace cuffs and authority. You may be my loyal musketeer." "Must I? I was hoping for something less heroic. Perhaps a quiet monk." "Nonsense. You've the shoulders for gallantry, and a musketeer's hat will suit you better than that dreadful fishing one." He accepted defeat with long practice. "Very well, but I draw the line at tights." She ignored him, already lost in visions of velvet and feathers. Across the room the wireless droned into the news bulletin. "A burglary reported last night at Weston Manor. Police confirm the disappearance of several valuable jewels. No arrests have yet been made." Tuppence's ears pricked up. "Weston Manor, isn't that near Langley?" 10 miles or so," Tommy said, "though unless the burglar plans to attend the ball, I doubt it concerns us." "Still," she mused, "one can't help noticing the coincidence." "Coincidences," said Tommy, "are merely facts taking a holiday." He turned a page. "And you, my dear, are about to turn this innocent invitation into another escapade. Escapades keep one young. They also keep one bruised." She tossed a dishcloth at him, laughing. "You'll thank me when we're waltzing beneath chandeliers instead of drowning in crockery." He caught the cloth easily. "I'd thank you more if it didn't end with corpses." "Tommy." "Well, it's a statistical observation. Every time we attend anything that sounds even faintly social, someone expires. That's because people are careless. They shouldn't die in one's vicinity if they wish to avoid investigation. Her eyes sparkled, and Tommy surrendered with the air of a man who has learned resistance is both futile and fondly admired. Very well, one musketeer reluctantly reporting for duty. Shall I bring my sword or my common sense? Bring both, she said. We may need them equally. That evening, after dinner, the invitation lay propped on the mantelpiece like a promise. The gold lettering caught the firelight, gleaming with faint menace. Tuppence sat at her writing desk, humming as she composed an acceptance note. Do you suppose there'll be actual riddles? She asked. Probably the sort involving paper clues and drawing rooms, Tommy said, polishing his pipe. The Langleys love theatrical nonsense. Then we shall excel, she said firmly. We have experience in theatrical nonsense. True, though last time it nearly got us deported from Monte Carlo. That was diplomacy, not nonsense. She looked up. You did keep that newspaper, didn't you? He handed it over. On the front page, the Western Manor burglary occupied 2 short columns. Jewels missing, no suspects, nothing thrilling. Yet the article mentioned Sir Reginald Langley among the guests at a recent charity event there. See, she said, tapping the name. He was present at the scene of the robbery only days before inviting half of England to his house. Isn't that intriguing? Coincidental, Tommy repeated, but less certain. Tuppence folded the paper neatly. I think, she said, that this masquerade may offer more entertainment than advertised. Or indigestion, he murmured. She ignored him, pen flying across the paper. Mr. and Mrs. Beresford accept with pleasure. There. She sealed it triumphantly. Adventure begins with good manners. Tommy laughed. Adventure begins with your curiosity and ends with my headache. Then bring aspirin, she said sweetly. The next morning dawned with deceptive peace. The invitation, now gone to post, had already worked its mischief. Tuppence's breakfast was consumed in a flurry of catalogues and costume sketches. Tommy's toast grew cold under a heap of fabric swatches. I found the perfect Duchess gown. Silk brocade, genuine reproduction, she announced. It will arrive Friday. And what am I wearing precisely? I've arranged it. A musketeer's ensemble from Mrs. Hartford's theatrical shop. Tommy groaned. The same Mrs. Hartford who lent us the disguises for that haunted house business. The very one. She promised these are less haunted. He gave up and poured more coffee. You realize we're going to spend the evening pretending to enjoy ourselves amongst people who own more silverware than sense. Tuppence looked thoughtful. Yes, but sometimes the dullest parties hide the most interesting crimes. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. There you go again, hoping for corpses. I never hope for them, she said, mock severe. They simply appear, like mushrooms after rain. Let's pray it's a dry season. She smiled, entirely unrepentant. Nonsense, I feel it in my bones, Tommy. This will be no ordinary masquerade. He sighed. That, my dear Tuppence, is precisely what I'm afraid of. As she turned back to her lists, the autumn light caught on the gilt of the invitation once more. It gleamed for a moment like a spark, small, bright, and dangerous, before fading into the quiet hum of the house. And thus, without the faintest idea of what lay ahead, Mr. and Mrs. Beresford accepted their next case in the guise of an evening's entertainment. The gravel of the Langley Grange drive crackled beneath the motorcar's tyres as Tommy brought it to a stop. The house loomed ahead, all turrets and confidence, its windows blazing with golden light. From within came the faint drift of laughter and a waltz that sounded just slightly too eager. Tuppence adjusted her Duchess's mask in the mirror and turned to her husband. You may at least pretend enthusiasm, Tommy. It's not every evening one waltzes into a mystery wearing ostrich feathers. He surveyed himself gloomily, doublet, cloak, and the plumed hat of a weary musketeer. You've misread the invitation. It said masks and mystery, not marital coercion. She smiled, the kind that meant she'd already won. A good detective never underdresses. A liveried footman opened the great oak door, and warmth and candlelight spilled into the cool air. Inside Langley Grange was a carnival of colour and chatter. The hall shimmered with silk, sequins, and the glint of too much champagne. Guests floated past like exotic birds escaped from their cages, a Cleopatra arm in arm with a pirate, a nun laughing behind a feathered domino mask, a Roman senator clearly regretting his sandals. "Good evening," boomed Sir Reginald Langley, expansive in satin and diamonds, his mask discarded for a monocle. His ruddy face shone with self-approval. "Ah, the Beresfords. Splendid to see you. You've come to lend the evening some style." "Not to mention substance," murmured Tommy. Lady Langley followed, swathed in scarlet and civility. Her smile might have been painted on. "Do enjoy yourselves," she said, pressing a cold hand to Tuppence's. "There's champagne by the gallery, and of course our little amusement later. Sir Reginald insists on riddles. He calls it his intellectual contribution." Tuppence's eyes twinkled. "How delightful. Nothing stirs the blood like organised guessing." They moved through the crowd. The air shimmered with perfume and laughter, though beneath it ran a faint undercurrent, like a melody half a tone off key. Tuppence's instinct for atmosphere was rarely wrong. At the far end of the ballroom, on a velvet-draped plinth, a diamond necklace sparkled beneath glass. Lady Langley's famed Star of India, displayed as the evening's prize. Tuppence paused before it admiringly. "Gorgeous," she murmured, "and conveniently valuable. I do hope the riddle doesn't involve sleight of hand." Tommy leaned closer. "If it does, I'll guard the exit." They drifted onward, mingling. The guests were a cross-section of society at its most theatrical. A member of Parliament disguised as Mephistopheles, a young actress shimmering in silver silk whose laugh came too loud and too often, and a portly bishop whose mask had slipped to his nose. Tuppence, observing keenly, catalogued expressions and alliances the way some women noted hats. Near the refreshments, a young maid trembled as she refilled glasses. Her hands shook so badly that champagne fizzed over the rim. Tuppence steadied the tray. "Easy, my dear. First ball nerves." The girl's eyes darted to the staircase. "No, ma'am, it's just—" She bit her lip, then curtsied and fled. "Interesting," said Tuppence softly. "Perhaps she's allergic to masquerades," Tommy offered. "Or to something, or someone, present," she murmured. A ripple of laughter rose nearby. Lady Langley stood near a side door, her face pale behind her sequined mask. Opposite her, a tall figure in a harlequin costume bowed with mocking grace. His mask was black and gold, his voice low and edged. "You didn't invite me," he said. "You weren't meant to come," Lady Langley whispered fiercely. "Yet here I am." The harlequin's gloved hand brushed hers, and she flinched. "Don't worry, my lady. I never reveal secrets, unless pressed." He moved away as smoothly as he'd arrived, vanishing into the crowd. Tuppence caught only fragments, but they were enough to ignite her curiosity. She turned to Tommy. "Did you hear that?" "Only that we've entered Act 2 of a melodrama." "Exactly. I wonder who our mysterious harlequin might be. Possibly someone who enjoys dramatic entrances. Or someone with a hold over our hostess." Tuppence's gaze lingered on Lady Langley's trembling hand, her smile fixed too firmly. Before she could pursue it, a small procession emerged. Sir Reginald, looking flushed with importance, accompanied by a man in scholarly black robes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we shall shortly begin our masquerade riddle hunt." Applause rippled through the room. The robed man, introduced as Dr. Havisham, an expert in mental diversion, produced envelopes tied with orange ribbon. "You will find," he said, "a clue within each envelope. Follow them through the house and grounds. The one who solves all riddles first shall win the Star of India, or, more precisely, a replica of it." A collective sigh of amusement. Tuppence leaned to Tommy. "A replica tonight, a theft tomorrow. It's practically begging to happen." "Don't volunteer us as witnesses," he replied, pocketing 2 envelopes. "Too late." As the guests scattered, laughter and rustle of fabric filled the corridors. Candlelight flickered along the walls, casting 1,000 darting shadows. Tuppence opened their envelope. "Seek where reflection doubles truth, and lies are framed in guilt." "The mirror gallery," said Tommy promptly. They moved toward it, past rooms alive with chatter and clinking glasses. Tuppence's sharp eyes caught a fleeting sight. The harlequin again, slipping up the servants' stairs. She tugged Tommy's arm. "There's our mystery man. Not much for riddles, is he?" "Or playing his own game," Tommy said, "which, Knowing our luck will involve crime. The mirror gallery stretched long and gleaming, candles multiplied endlessly in reflection. Other guests fluttered in, laughing at their own distortions. The MP as Mephistopheles flirted shamelessly with the actress, whose diamonds caught the light suspiciously well for costume jewellery. Tuppence inspected the mantelpiece. Ah, another envelope. She opened it to find the next riddle. Seek the fox where fruit once fell. The orchard, guessed Tommy. Or the orangery. She smiled. Langley Grange is hardly known for agriculture. They turned back toward the hall. As they passed the refreshment table again, the trembling maid was gone. In her place stood the butler, glassy-eyed and severe. "Enjoying yourselves, sir, madam?" "Immensely," said Tuppence. "Tell me, has everyone here been invited?" His expression didn't flicker. "Everyone of note, madam." "And the harlequin?" A pause, almost imperceptible. An eccentric choice of attire, perhaps, but not for me to comment. He moved away before she could press him. Tommy exhaled. "There's something about this house that makes me wish we'd brought Albert instead of a corkscrew." "You underestimate the corkscrew's versatility," she said. The ballroom clock chimed 9. A tremor seemed to run through the lights, a brief flicker, then steady again. Conversations faltered, laughter thinned, and someone exclaimed, "Power failure, how perfectly atmospheric." Sir Reginald's voice boomed, "Nothing to worry about. Modern wiring. Temperamental beast." But the air had changed. Beneath the gaiety, unease breathed. Tuppence folded her clue card carefully. "It begins," she said quietly. Tommy looked at her sidelong. "The riddle hunt?" "Something rather better than that." Her smile was quick and knowing. The night's first mystery. They turned together toward the shadowed hall, where masked figures moved like pieces on an unseen board, laughter masking lies, champagne masking nerves, and the stage of Langley Grange prepared, almost graciously, for its coming crime. The second riddle had led them down a side corridor lined with ancestral portraits, grim men in periwigs and women who looked as if they had never forgiven posterity. The candlelight quivered over gilt frames, making painted eyes seem to follow their movements. Tuppence held her clue card up to the flicker. "Seek the fox where fruit once fell." We've already guessed the orangery, haven't we? Tommy adjusted the plume on his hat, which had spent most of the evening drooping in protest. "You have. I merely follow in loyal resignation." "You make it sound as though devotion were a form of martyrdom." "In this marriage, it occasionally is." Her answering laugh echoed lightly off the panelled walls as they descended the back staircase. From somewhere ahead drifted the strains of a string quartet valiantly battling against the acoustics of marble floors and gossiping guests. In the drawing room, Cleopatra had cornered Mephistopheles for a whispered conversation. The man's voice, low and urgent, carried just enough to reach Tuppence's keen ear. "You must stay quiet about the summer in Paris," he said, "for all our sakes." Cleopatra's painted smile did not falter. "And if someone else remembers?" "Then we shall all wish they hadn't." Tuppence's eyebrows arched beneath her mask. She nudged Tommy. "Did you catch that?" "Only the part about Paris. I didn't realize this ball included continental intrigue. It seems every English country house comes equipped with it nowadays." They moved on, her curiosity firmly engaged. In the corridor beyond the drawing room, Sir Reginald's steward stood sentinel before a heavy door. He was a tall, rigid man whose face looked as though it had been pressed from cold wax. "Library's closed for the evening, madam," he said quickly before Tuppence had even opened her mouth. "How inconvenient," she replied sweetly. "Libraries are usually where the clues hide." "House rules, madam." His hand hovered near the doorknob as though guarding something within. Tuppence's gaze flicked toward the keyhole, fresh scratches around it, faintly glinting. She stored the detail quietly away. Tommy murmured, "I think he'd rather wrestle a bear than let you peek behind that door." "Which makes one wonder what the bear is guarding," she murmured back. They continued toward the orangery, their path lit by wall sconces and laughter echoing through the halls. Costumed guests hurried past, clutching their riddle cards, their excitement growing as the game progressed. Someone shrieked with laughter from the dining room. Someone else called for more champagne. Tuppence, however, had begun to slip into her sleuth's rhythm, eyes scanning, mind ticking. "Notice how no one's seen the harlequin since the quarrel," she said. "Perhaps he took the theme too literally, and vanished in a puff of mystery. "I rather think he's our fox." "Then the fruit must be the bait." "Exactly," she said approvingly. "You're learning." The orangery lay at the end of a long gallery whose windows framed the night like panels of black glass. The air here was warmer, scented faintly with soil and citrus. Rows of orange trees stood in regimented lines beneath arched ceilings, their leaves catching candlelight like little mirrors. Tuppence stepped inside, her heels clicking softly on the tiled floor. The murmur of the party faded behind them, replaced by a hush that seemed to breathe. Somewhere a drop of water fell from a leaf into a basin, slow, deliberate. "This," she said, "is precisely the sort of room in which discoveries occur." "Or drafts," said Tommy, rubbing his neck. She ignored him, scanning the benches. A single overturned flower pot caught her eye. Beneath it, half hidden by spilled earth, lay a glove, black silk, monogrammed neatly with the initials RLRL, she repeated softly. "Reginald Langley?" Tommy frowned. "Our host. He doesn't strike me as the glove-dropping type." "No, but perhaps the glove wasn't dropped. Perhaps it was placed." She lifted it delicately, sniffed it, and froze. "Gunpowder." Tommy's brows shot up. "Gunpowder? You're certain?" "I'm not likely to mistake it. There's a distinct tang, sharp, metallic. Someone's been handling fireworks or firearms." And here I was hoping this riddle hunt wouldn't explode. She slipped the glove into her reticule. "It's evidence now." He sighed. "You're making this sound like work." "It usually becomes that." Before he could reply, a faint noise reached them, a rustle beyond the orange trees, followed by the soft creak of a door at the far end. Tuppence gestured for silence. They moved together, quietly toward the sound. Through the glass panes they saw movement, a shadow crossing the moonlit terrace outside. The figure wore something dark, the edge of a cape fluttering. Then the door slammed shut, echoing sharply. Tommy lunged forward, but the latch had been bolted from the outside. "Too late," he muttered. "Our fox has fled." Tuppence turned back to the orangery. "Then we're left with the scent of gunpowder and the initials of our host. How very tidy." From somewhere above, a faint hum of music resumed, the string quartet beginning another tune. But even as the notes drifted down, the lights overhead flickered once, twice, then died. The darkness was absolute. Tommy swore softly. "What the devil?" "Hush," Tuppence whispered. "Listen." For a moment there was only silence, thick and muffled, the sort that presses against the ears. Then, faintly, from beyond the glass doors came a thud, followed by a single sharp scream. It tore through the dark, high and brief, slicing the music above into silence. Tuppence's hand found Tommy's arm. "That wasn't part of the entertainment." He strained to listen, every muscle taut. "Stay here. I'll find—" But before he could finish, the lights blazed back on, glaringly bright. The suddenness made everyone blink. In that instant, the orangery seemed unchanged. Rows of trees, gleaming leaves, scattered soil. Yet everything felt altered, as if the air itself had shifted allegiance. Tuppence's eyes darted to the terrace door. It now stood ajar, swinging slightly, and a faint draught crept in, cool against her cheek. She drew a breath. "Tommy, someone's been hurt." He nodded grimly. "Or worse." They stepped onto the terrace. From this vantage they could see part of the garden, faintly lit by lanterns hung along the balustrade. Guests were appearing at distant doors, their laughter replaced by uneasy chatter. A woman's voice cried out again, nearer this time, followed by the unmistakable crash of glass. "Stay close," Tommy said, though it was more habit than command. Tuppence was already moving ahead, skirts brushing stone. The scent of gunpowder hung heavier now, mingled with something darker, the acrid tang of fear. "Do you see anything?" she whispered. He shook his head. "Only shadows." Then came footsteps, running, urgent, and the steward from the library appeared, pale and breathless. "Sir Reginald requests everyone return to the ballroom at once," he announced. "There's been an accident." "An accident?" Tuppence repeated. "Yes, madam. Please, this way." His manner was too brisk, his voice too steady. She recognized the tone of someone trying very hard not to sound alarmed. As they followed him back toward the main hall, the corridors buzzed with speculation. The music had stopped entirely now. Only the shuffle of feet and murmured questions filled the silence. Tommy leaned close. Gunpowder, screams, and now an accident. What are the odds? Small, she said, and shrinking by the minute. They reached the threshold of the ballroom. The candles still burned in their sconces, the scent of perfume lingering, but the gaiety was gone. Guests clustered in uneasy knots, masks askew. Sir Reginald stood near the dais, red-faced and sweating, while Lady Langley clutched a handkerchief in trembling fingers. Tuppence's gaze swept the room, searching, counting. Where's the harlequin? Tommy followed her eyes. The jesting mask, the diamond-patterned costume, nowhere to be seen. And suddenly Tuppence knew the scream had not been for nothing. She glanced down at her gloved hand, still faintly dusted with earth from the orangery. Our riddle, she said softly, has just turned deadly. The ballroom's sudden glare threw its former festivity into cruel relief, every sparkle now a stain. The laughter that had bubbled moments before now broke into gasps, and one scream lingered, shrill and unending, until it faltered into sobs. Tuppence's eyes went first to the floor. There, among the swirl of costumes and overturned chairs, the harlequin lay sprawled on the marble tiles, one arm flung wide, the other folded beneath him at an unnatural angle. The bright diamond-patterned costume was slashed with darker stains. A jewelled dagger, cruelly ornate, jutted from his chest. For a long moment no one moved. Then a voice, Sir Reginald's, bellowed above the chaos. Good heavens, what's the meaning of this? Stop that infernal screaming. Lady Langley, pale behind her mask, clutched the edge of a table. Reginald! He's dead! Nonsense, her husband snapped, though his ruddy complexion had drained to parchment. It's part of the entertainment, one of those tricks Havisham arranged, I dare say. Dr. Havisham, the evening's master of riddles, looked as though he'd sooner face a firing squad than claim credit. I assure you, Sir Reginald, this is no part of my design. Tuppence was already moving. She knelt beside the fallen man, her duchess skirts pooling around her. Tommy, she said quietly, keep everyone back. Her fingers hovered briefly above the dagger, careful not to touch. The hilt was carved in the shape of a fox's head, its eyes set with garnets that gleamed like tiny drops of blood. Around the blade, the fabric shimmered wetly. Dead, I think, she murmured. The wound's clean and deep. Tommy crouched beside her. You'd make a ghastly doctor, darling. Doctors deal in life. Detectives deal in what's left. Sir Reginald puffed forward, blustering. Now see here, it's some ghastly misunderstanding, a prank gone wrong. Tuppence rose, brushing her gloves. Pranks don't generally require paramedics, Sir Reginald. The assembled guests had gathered into uneasy knots, masks askew, laughter gone brittle. The bishop mopped his forehead with a lace kerchief. The actress in silver looked faintly thrilled. Someone in a pirate costume retched discreetly behind a curtain. The steward appeared, white-faced. "Shall I summon the constabulary, sir?" "Of course not," barked Sir Reginald. "The man's probably fainted. Give him air." But, even as he said it, his voice wavered. Tuppence's cool tone cut through the noise. "If the constabulary aren't called, I shall do it myself. This man has been murdered." The word hung in the air like smoke. Lady Langley made a small, strangled sound and turned away. Within minutes, servants were dispatched and chairs drawn back. The guests were shepherded toward the ballroom's edges, murmuring, speculating, inventing theories before facts had formed. Tuppence observed the shifting faces, the quick glances, the suppressed panic, storing every detail. Tommy leaned toward her. "Well, that's the end of the party." "For some of us," she said softly. It took half an hour for the local constable to arrive, a round, flustered man in a uniform that seemed a size too large and a confidence 2 sizes too small. "Constable Briggs," he introduced himself, blinking at the chandeliered grandeur of Langley Grange, as though expecting the walls to make an arrest on his behalf. Right, he said, clearing his throat. "Now, what's all this about a stabbing? I was told it might be a prank." Sir Reginald seized the explanation eagerly. "Exactly so, all in jest, I'm sure. Fellow took the game too seriously." Briggs frowned at the harlequin's still form. "Doesn't look very jesting to me, sir. We'll need to keep everyone here till morning." A chorus of protest followed, led by the actress who wailed about her engagements in town. Briggs held up a hand for silence, which had precisely the opposite effect. Amid the confusion, Tuppence slipped closer to the constable. "Might I suggest you begin by identifying the victim?" Briggs blinked. Yes, quite right. Name?" Sir Reginald cleared his throat, his moustache twitching. "Ah, well, fellow came as a guest of Lady Langley's, or perhaps of Cousin Randolph's. I don't quite recall." Lady Langley, pale as lace, shook her head. "I assumed he was a friend of yours, Reginald." The murmurs grew. Tuppence's tone was even. "Are you telling us no one here knows who he is?" A silence fell, heavy and absurd. Briggs looked from one face to another, bewildered. "Well, someone must. You can't just have a corpse turn up in fancy dress without an invitation." Tommy muttered, "It appears you can." Tuppence's eyes were sharp beneath her mask. "Constable, might we remove his mask?" Yes, of course." The constable bent down awkwardly and tugged the black and gold mask free. The gasps that followed were louder than the scream that had preceded them. The face beneath was that of a man in his 40s. Dark hair slicked back, strong jawline, expression frozen between surprise and terror. A thin scar traced his left cheek. Tuppence drew in a breath. "Oh, my word," Tommy stared. That's Victor Durant." The name sparked recognition like a struck match. They had met him years before, a smooth-tongued con artist who had sold forged antiques to half of Mayfair and nearly taken Tommy in with a counterfeit watch scheme in Monte Carlo. He had vanished after a narrow escape from prosecution. "So, he's traded watches for daggers," Tommy murmured. Tuppence's gaze flicked to the jewelled weapon still lodged in his chest. "Or perhaps someone finally collected on his debts." Briggs looked from one to the other. You know the fellow?" "Regrettably," Tuppence said. "And if he's at Langley Grange, uninvited and under a mask, I suspect he came for something, or someone." Sir Reginald was sweating freely now. "Good heavens, I had no idea the man was even here." Tuppence's tone was dry. "You might wish to check your guest list more carefully in future." An hour later, the body had been removed to the study, and the guests confined to the drawing-room under Constable Briggs's flustered supervision. Tuppence, moving quietly, surveyed the scene with a professional calm that belied her racing mind. The dagger's fox-headed hilt lingered in her thoughts. "Seek the fox where fruit once fell." The riddle's line echoed from earlier in the night. Coincidence or warning? Tommy joined her near the staircase. "Lady Langley's having hysterics. I've stationed myself between her and the champagne." "Good. Keep her talking. People reveal more through tears than testimony." "And what are you doing?" "Thinking." She glanced toward the library door, still guarded by the steward. "That room interests me." "Because you weren't allowed in?" "Precisely. I dislike locked doors in murder houses." Tommy sighed. "Remind me to install a revolving one at home." She smiled faintly, but her eyes were fixed on the steward, who stood rigid as a statue. His gaze flickered toward Lady Langley once briefly, with an expression not of fear, but of pity. Tuppence noted it. Pity, she thought, was rarely innocent. When she returned to the drawing-room, Lady Langley sat in an armchair, her mask gone, her complexion ghostly. Tommy stood beside her, offering the useless comfort of a handkerchief. "I can't imagine why he was here," Lady Langley murmured. "Victor Durant. I'd heard he'd gone abroad." Tuppence's tone was light. "Did you know him, Lady Langley?" The woman hesitated a beat too long. "Barely. He attended one of our charity events years ago. Nothing more." "Yet he knew enough to find his way to your home, uninvited." Lady Langley's lips tightened. "Anyone could have learned of the ball. It was in the Gazette." "Of course," Tuppence smiled gently. "Then he might simply have come for the champagne." The remark earned her a sharp look from Sir Reginald, who had been pacing by the fire. "I'll not have insinuations in my house." "Then perhaps you should keep fewer secrets in it," she said softly. Before he could retort, a servant entered with a whispered message for the constable. Briggs turned pale. "They've found something, sir," the man said. "In the orangery. Marks on the floor. Looks like someone dragged something heavy." The room fell still again. Tuppence exchanged a glance with Tommy, quick, charged. "Dragged?" she repeated. "Then the murder wasn't committed here." Sir Reginald's protest died in his throat. She moved toward the door, her voice quiet but decisive. "Come along, Tommy. It seems the night has more riddles yet." And as they stepped into the dim corridor, the faint echo of the orchestra's last unfinished note still lingered in the air, a ghost of gaiety that now sounded almost like a dirge. The identity of the Harlequin spread through Langley Grange like smoke, swift, choking, and impossible to contain. By morning, the newspapers would no doubt call it the Masquerade murder, but for now the grand ballroom, stripped of its music and laughter, echoed only with whispers. Victor Durant. The name carried with it a trail of scandal and sun-drenched deceit that had once stretched from Monte Carlo to Marseille. As she stood over the covered body, Tuppence remembered him vividly, a man of elegance and danger, the kind who could charm a duchess out of her jewels and a policeman out of his suspicion. She and Tommy had crossed paths with him on the Riviera years ago, in a case involving forged wills and vanishing heiresses. He'd escaped arrest through sheer audacity and a talent for reinvention. Now he lay in the Langley study, very still, his final disguise discarded. Tuppence stood near the hearth, her expression thoughtful as she gazed at the lifeless form beneath the white sheet. The scent of extinguished candles hung in the air, mingled with wax and the faint tang of gunpowder that lingered on the glove she had found earlier. Tommy, perched uncomfortably on the edge of a chaise, spoke in the low, reflective tone of a man who disliked being right. "You'll have to admit, darling, my prediction was accurate. We go to parties, and people die." Tuppence didn't answer immediately. "He came here for something," she said. "Not pleasure, purpose." "Blackmail?" "Almost certainly. It was his profession, though I doubt he came alone." She turned as the door creaked open and Sir Reginald's cousin drifted in. Randolph Langley was a thin, nervous man with a scholar's stoop and a flair for theatrical melancholy. His mask had long been discarded, but the impression of it remained, a faint outline across his pale face. He cleared his throat. "Sir Reginald insists this house will not be turned into a spectacle," he said, glancing nervously toward the body. "He's concerned about scandal." Tommy muttered, "It's a bit late for that. There's already a corpse." Randolph winced. "Yes, well, scandal has a way of lingering longer than corpses." Tuppence gave him a sympathetic smile. "You knew the dead man, Mr. Langley." "I wouldn't say knew," Randolph replied too quickly. "He approached me last week, quite out of the blue, claimed he possessed a document, something relating to an old family matter. He hinted it might interest my cousin. I told him to go to the devil." "Did he specify what sort of document?" Randolph hesitated. "No, but he used the word proof. It unsettled me. Durant was one of those men who made every conversation sound like a threat." Tuppence tilted her head. "And yet, you didn't mention this to Sir Reginald." A flush crept up Randolph's neck. "I thought it a bluff. He had that Riviera glibness about him. You never quite know whether such men are lying or merely rehearsing truth." Tuppence's gaze flicked to Tommy, who raised an eyebrow in quiet agreement. "Thank you, Mr. Langley," she said softly. "You've been most helpful." When he had gone, Tommy stretched, grimacing. "Family secrets, blackmail, and a dead scoundrel. We're halfway through a serialized novel already." Tuppence smiled faintly. "Let's see how the next chapter unfolds." They found the nervous maid in the kitchen, her face streaked with soot and fear. Smoke curled lazily from the open stove. She jumped as Tuppence entered, clutching her apron. I didn't mean—" Tuppence's voice was kind but firm. "You were trying to burn something, weren't you?" The girl's lips trembled. "It was just a letter, miss. Not important." "Then you won't mind if I rescue what's left." She reached deftly into the ash and drew out a half-burned envelope. The paper was singed but legible. The writing, elegant and slanted, read, "To V.D. from a friend who remembers Paris." Tuppence held it up. "Paris again. Our evening seems determined to revisit the Riviera." The maid began to cry. "He told me to deliver it. He said it was private. I didn't know he'd be killed." "Who told you?" The girl hesitated, twisting her apron. "The Harlequin, miss. Mr. Durant himself. Said if anyone asked, I was to say nothing. He paid me £5. Tommy whistled softly. £5 for silence, that's generous. Silence must have been expensive last night. Tuppence's tone was gentler. Did you open the letter? The maid shook her head, wide-eyed. No, miss, I swear it. Tuppence nodded, satisfied. All right, go and rest, but please don't leave the house. When the girl had gone, Tommy examined the letter. What do you make of it? I think Mr. Durant was playing a familiar game. Secrets for sale. Someone paid to keep their past quiet, and last night the transaction failed. He grinned. You sound almost admiring. I admire efficiency, she said dryly. Murder, however, complicates business arrangements. The guests, confined to the drawing-room under polite protest, were beginning to fray. The actress paced by the window, every step measured for effect. The bishop prayed loudly in the corner, though his eyes kept darting toward the decanter. Lady Langley, pale and composed, sat by the fire, her gaze unfocused. Tuppence approached her softly. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, Lady Langley. I wondered if you might help me understand Mr. Durant's presence here. Lady Langley's lips tightened. I've told the police all I can. I didn't invite him. I hadn't seen him in years. You had seen him then? For a moment, silence, then. He was acquainted with certain friends of mine abroad. He knew things best forgotten. If he came here, it was to make mischief. Tuppence's eyes were kind, but her voice held quiet precision. And he tried to speak with you last night, didn't he? Lady Langley looked up sharply. How do you... I saw him approach you near the garden door. You seemed distressed. Lady Langley rose abruptly, smoothing her gown. I was surprised, that's all, to see an unwelcome ghost. Tommy joined them, holding a mask he'd found on a side table. Speaking of ghosts, he said cheerfully, someone's left this behind. The mask was plain black silk, the inside smeared faintly with crimson lipstick. Tuppence studied it. Not Durant's, and not Lady Langley's shade, I think. Lady Langley's composure faltered. I can't imagine who it belongs to. Perhaps to someone who didn't wish to be recognized, Tuppence said, or someone who shared a private conversation with him before he died. Lady Langley's hand trembled as she adjusted her necklace. You're suggesting... I'm suggesting, said Tuppence gently, that the truth at Langley Grange wears more than one mask. Later, in the quiet of a side corridor, Tommy caught her arm. Darling, that was positively wicked. Interrogation is an art form, she said. Lady Langley's guilty of something, perhaps not murder, but certainly deceit. And the mask? A red herring, most likely, but I'd like to know who wears that particular shade of lipstick. Tommy smirked. Shall I conduct a survey? You'd enjoy it too much. She smiled, then turned serious. Durant must have had leverage over at least one person here. Randolph spoke of a document, Lady Langley of Secrets from Abroad. The threads are tightening. He frowned thoughtfully. And the glove? Still marked R.L., Reginald Langley. Yes, she said, eyes narrowing. Either coincidence or a warning. The fox-headed dagger, the initials, the riddle's clue, all point toward our host. But perhaps that's exactly what we're meant to believe. Tommy nodded slowly. A misdirection. Indeed, a magician's flourish. They reached the landing overlooking the ballroom, now dim and echoing with the ghosts of the night's laughter. Tuppence rested her hands on the balustrade, her expression distant. Durant, she said softly. The man could juggle 6 lies at once and make them all sound like truth. Even in death he's performing. Tommy placed a hand over hers. And you're his closing act. She smiled faintly. Perhaps, but unlike Durant, I never gamble without knowing the odds. Below them, the constable's voice echoed faintly through the hall, summoning the household again. Another witness, another question, another mask to lift. Tuppence straightened. Come along, Tommy. It's time to see who flinches first. The grand clock in Langley Grange struck midnight with the solemnity of a judge passing sentence. Each resonant chime rolled through the manor's corridors, echoing against the hush that had descended since Victor Durant's body was carried away. The guests had been gathered into the drawing-room under polite house arrest, an uneasy collection of silks, jewels, and trembling fans. But Tuppence Beresford had never been one for waiting quietly. I feel, she said, pacing the length of the hall, as if the air itself is pretending to be calm. It's lying, Tommy. Everything in this house is lying. Her husband, seated on the arm of a chaise with a half-empty teacup, smiled faintly. It's also past midnight, and we're confined like misbehaving children. Even liars get tired, my dear. Perhaps, she said, turning toward the corridor, but truth doesn't sleep, and I intend to wake it. Before he could stop her, she was already halfway to the library. The library of Langley Grange was the kind of room that might have impressed a bishop and intimidated a burglar, vast, oak-panelled, and heavy with the scent of paper, polish, and the quiet vanity of inherited knowledge. The fire had burned low, its embers pulsing like the last heartbeats of a dying secret. Tuppence stood in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust. The air was still, too still. "Why is it," she murmured, "that every library connected with murder feels guilty?" Tommy joined her, closing the door softly behind them. "Because books know too much," he said, glancing around. "Or perhaps because they're full of alibis." She smiled briefly, but her attention had already shifted. The centre of the room drew her gaze, a glass display case, the sort meant to hold something precious. Its velvet interior was empty. Tuppence approached it slowly, noting the faint outline where an object had rested. "The Langley diamonds," she said. "Lady Langley's pride and joy. They were supposed to be locked away after the guests admired them earlier." Tommy frowned. "You think they're gone?" "I think," she said softly, "that Victor Durant's murder wasn't the only performance tonight." She crouched, examining the case. The lock showed no signs of forced entry, but a smudge, faint, oily, and marred the glass near the hinge. "Gloved fingers," she said. "Careful, but not professional. Someone who's done this before, but not often." Tommy came beside her, scanning the carpet. "There's been movement here. Look, the rug's shifted." He tugged it back to reveal a splash of ink, dark and glossy even in the dim light. "Spilled," he murmured. "And, wait." He crouched lower. "Footprint." Tuppence knelt beside him. The print was partial, the sole of a polished shoe, smudged where it met the ink, but it was distinct enough to see the crosshatch texture, not the plain leather of an evening shoe. "Not a guest's," she said. "Servants' shoes are rubber-soled. This is something in between, perhaps someone who changes roles when convenient." "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said. "Our thief may not have been an invited guest or a servant, but someone pretending to be both." Tommy whistled softly. A masquerade indeed. She stood, eyes sweeping the room. "2 crimes, Tommy. A murder and a theft. One covered the other." The sound of a page fluttering made them both turn. A draught stirred the heavy curtains near the desk. Tuppence crossed to them, her eyes narrowing. A book lay open on the floor, The Scarlet Pimpernel. She stooped, retrieving it carefully. "Odd choice for bedtime reading," she murmured. Tommy peered over her shoulder. Perhaps someone was searching for clues to heroic disguise. Or hiding one. As she lifted the book, a folded slip of paper fell out. The edges were crisp, the fold deliberate. She unfolded it and read aloud. "At midnight, the fox will run free." They stared at it. Tommy gave a low whistle. "I don't suppose that's an invitation to a nature walk." "No," Tuppence said. "It's a message, code or signal. Durant may have received it or written it." "Fox," Tommy repeated. "We've heard that before, haven't we? The fox-headed dagger, and the riddle clue at the Masquerade. Seek the fox where fruit once fell." Her eyes gleamed. "Precisely. Durant's death and the diamond's disappearance are tied together by that symbol." She placed the note on the desk, flattening it with one gloved hand. "Fox. Cunning. Deceit. Survival. Someone here plays the fox." They were interrupted by a soft shuffle near the doorway. Tommy turned sharply. "Who's there?" The butler stood on the threshold. Mr. Elkins, stooped and pale, his face as lined as the bindings of the book surrounding them. He held a candle that trembled in his hand, its flame bowing to every tremor. "Beg pardon, sir, madam," he said, voice low. "I was told to check that all rooms were secure." Tuppence regarded him steadily. "You've been in this house a long time, haven't you, Mr. Elkins?" "All my life, ma'am, my father before me." "And yet tonight it seems the house has turned against itself." The butler's throat worked. It's not my place to speak of such things." "On the contrary," Tuppence said softly, "if you don't, someone else may speak for you, and less kindly." He hesitated, the candle quivering in his grasp. "There's been talk," he said finally, "servants' talk, about Mr. Durant. He came 2 nights ago, after dark, met with Sir Reginald privately in this very room." "Met with him," Tommy repeated. "Why wasn't that mentioned to the constable?" "Sir Reginald asked that it be forgotten," Elkin said quietly. "Said it was a matter of business. But Mr. Durant, he wasn't satisfied. He said he'd return on the night of the masquerade, when all the masks would be worn and one more would be lifted." Tuppence exchanged a quick glance with Tommy. Blackmail, then. He had leverage. Elkins nodded miserably. "And Sir Reginald told me, when I brought in the wine, that he'd deal with it his own way. He was a good man once, ma'am. But these last years, debts, quarrels, whispers, the diamonds were meant to be sold quietly to pay what he owed." Tuppence's gaze hardened. "And now they're gone." The butler's hand shook so violently that a droplet of wax fell to the floor. "I don't know how, ma'am, I swear it, but someone else must have known of the arrangement." "Someone," Tommy said, "who killed Durant to keep their own dealings safe." Elkins nodded again, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He said something strange before I left him that night. 'The fox runs when the trap is sprung,' he said. I thought it was nonsense." Tuppence's mind raced. "No, Mr. Elkins, it wasn't nonsense, it was warning." After the butler departed, they stood for a long moment in the firelight, the house creaking around them. Tommy broke the silence. "So, let's tally the suspects. Sir Reginald, who's broke, his wife who's hiding something from abroad, Randolph with his mysterious document, and possibly an invisible fox." "And a missing necklace," Tuppence added. "Don't forget the treasure." She crossed to the window, peering into the dark garden beyond. The moon had risen above the hedgerows, painting the lawn in silvery stripes. The orangery stood at the far end, silent and watchful. "At midnight, the fox will run free," she repeated. Tommy joined her, following her gaze. If it's code, who was meant to read it? "Perhaps not Durant. Perhaps it was a message to someone else, an accomplice." He frowned. "But why leave it here?" "Because this was the safest place in the house. Everyone assumes the library is a sanctuary, where secrets are kept, not found." Her reflection in the glass caught her own half-smile. But tonight, even the books have started whispering. The clock struck the quarter hour. Somewhere below, voices murmured, the constable questioning servants, Lady Langley protesting her innocence, Randolph inventing new versions of his story. Tuppence turned toward the desk again, where the ink stain glistened like a dark mirror. She touched its edge with a gloved fingertip. "Someone wrote here recently," she said, "and spilled the truth along with the ink." Tommy grinned. "You sound poetic when you're suspicious." "I'm always poetic when I'm right." She closed the Scarlet Pimpernel gently, slipping the note inside again. "Let's not mention this message yet. I'd rather see who tries to find it." As they stepped out into the corridor, the light flickered, a candle guttering in the draught from an open door. The sound of the wind through the hall made the curtains sway like silent witnesses. Tuppence glanced back at the library one last time. The fire had dwindled to embers, and in the half-light the glass case gleamed faintly, an empty shrine to greed. "2 crimes," she murmured, "and one truth hiding between them." Tommy offered his arm. "And I suppose we'll be up till dawn finding it." "Of course," she said, slipping her hand through his. "That's what detectives do when the fox runs free." By now the air in Langley Grange had thinned into uneasy silence, the laughter of earlier hours only a ghost. The music was gone, the laughter spent. Even the chandeliers seemed to flicker with reluctance, throwing nervous light upon faces too weary and too watchful. The clock in the hall, pompous and unhurried, crept past 12:30, each chime sounding more weary than the last. Outside, the first tremors of a storm rattled the tall windows, setting the curtains swaying like uneasy ghosts. Tuppence Beresford stood at the centre of the ballroom, her Duchess costume somewhat askew, her eyes bright with thought. "We've spent 2 hours in whispers," she said crisply. "Whispers solve nothing. It's time we put our masquerade to better use." Tommy, leaning against the fireplace, raised an eyebrow. "You mean?" "I mean, we shall reenact it," she said. "Every step, every laugh, every conveniently missing minute. We'll see who was where when the lights went out." Sir Reginald sputtered. "Really, Mrs. Beresford, this is absurd. We've all been through quite enough without turning tragedy into theatre." Tuppence gave him a cool look. "Theatre, Sir Reginald, may be the only way to reveal who's been playing which part." Lady Langley, pale and tight-lipped, gave a small nod. "Let her do as she pleases. Perhaps it will calm the nerves." Tommy grinned faintly. "Or fray them beyond repair." The guests were assembled reluctantly, a mismatched company of silks, jewels, and unease. The actress in silver reclined against a chaise like a weary heroine. Randolph Langley wrung his hands by the decanter. The bishop stood near the door, looking heavenward for moral support that refused to descend. Tuppence's tone was brisk, almost businesslike. "We begin where the night began to go wrong, when the lights flickered at 9. Tommy, playing the part of stage manager, dimmed the lamps until the room glowed with uneasy half-light. "Now," Tuppence continued, "each of you will tell us, and show us, precisely where you were and what you were doing in the moments before and after darkness fell." The actress sighed dramatically. "Very well. I was by the refreshment table sampling the champagne, or attempting to. Someone had taken the Harlequin's glass. I thought it rather rude." Tuppence's gaze sharpened. "The Harlequin's champagne? You're certain?" "Oh, yes," the actress said, with a fluttering laugh. "I saw him set it down. I thought he'd gone to dance. When I took a sip, it tasted peculiar. Bitter. I poured it away. A pity. It was 28 vintage." A murmur went around the room. Tommy straightened. "And where is that glass now?" "Broken," the actress said lightly. "A clumsy waiter knocked it off the table during the commotion." "Convenient," Tuppence murmured. Sir Reginald cleared his throat. "If we're confessing, perhaps I should admit that I, stepped out to my study for a moment before the blackout, just to, collect myself." Randolph gave a dry laugh. "Collect yourself or the family silver?" Sir Reginald shot him a glare. "I'll thank you to mind your tone." Tuppence interjected smoothly. "And what was troubling you, Sir Reginald?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing of consequence. Merely financial matters. Some letters I'd rather not discuss." "Debt collectors?" Tommy asked cheerfully. "Possibly," Sir Reginald muttered. "Certainly not murderers." The reenactment continued in bursts of protest and confession. The bishop admitted he'd dozed in a corner. A sin of omission rather than commission, he declared. Lady Langley revealed she'd stepped outside briefly for air, and Randolph admitted to following her. Purely for concern, of course. As the farce unfolded, the storm outside found its voice, a low growl that rolled over the roof, followed by a brief flash of lightning that painted the room in white. For a heartbeat, all the masks and jewels seemed to glow like relics in a chapel. When the thunder died, Tuppence's eyes found the one man who hadn't spoken. "Mr. Elkins," she said gently, "the butler. We've heard from everyone but you." The old man stood by the sideboard, hands folded, face drawn. "I was in the hall, madam, making certain the doors were secure." "Before or after the blackout?" "During." His voice trembled. "I went to fetch candles." "Ah," Tuppence moved closer, studying him. "And when the lights returned?" "I saw confusion, guests shouting. I fetched water for Lady Langley, who had fainted." "Very diligent," she said softly. "And yet, your hands are shaking still." Elkins managed a wan smile. "I'm not as steady as I used to be." Tuppence's gaze didn't waver. "Perhaps not. Or perhaps you've seen something you shouldn't have." For a moment, silence stretched. Then Elkins reached for the decanter, pouring himself a small glass of water. "With respect, madam, I'm only a servant. I keep my eyes down and my mouth shut." He raised the glass to his lips and dropped it. The sound of shattering crystal rang through the room. Elkins swayed, clutching his throat, his candle falling to the carpet. "Tommy!" Tuppence cried, catching the butler as he collapsed. His face had turned grey, his breath rasping. "Poison," she said sharply. "Quick, fetch brandy." Tommy was already pouring it. The others crowded forward, horrified, their fear rising like heat. Sir Reginald stammered. "Good heavens, what now? Who'd poison a butler?" "Someone," Tuppence said grimly, who wanted to silence him. Elkin struggled to speak, his voice thin and fading. "The fox," he whispered. "Look, to the portrait." Then his eyes rolled back, and he went still. "Is he?" Lady Langley faltered. "Alive," Tuppence said. "Barely. It wasn't enough to kill, just to stop him speaking further." Tommy's eyes flicked to the nearest servant's door. "Poisoned water glass, I'd wager. Switched when he wasn't looking." Tuppence stood slowly, scanning the room. "Look to the portrait," she repeated. Her gaze swept across the walls, family ancestors glaring down from gilt frames. Then her eyes settled on one painting above the fireplace, a grand oil of a woman in 18th century finery, her face proud and cold. Lady Langley followed her gaze. "That's my husband's great-grandmother. The portrait's been there for decades." Tuppence moved closer, "and she's been keeping secrets just as long." Tommy joined her, helping shift a small table aside. Together they examined the edges of the frame. A faint scuff mark along the base caught her eye. "See that? The frame's been moved recently." She pressed gently against the lower panel, and it gave way with a soft click. Behind the portrait, half concealed in the wall, was a small steel door. "A safe," Tommy murmured. Lady Langley gasped. "I had no idea." "Of course not," said Tuppence. "Secrets always prefer to live behind ancestors." The safe door hung slightly ajar. Tuppence reached for the handle and swung it open. Inside, the space was shallow but neatly arranged. Papers, a jewellery case, and a velvet pouch. Sir Reginald stepped forward sharply. "I demand you leave that alone." "By all means," Tuppence said calmly. "Would you care to explain its contents first?" He hesitated, then blustered. "Family documents, nothing more." Tuppence withdrew a folded envelope. "Addressed to Victor Durant," she read aloud. The silence was thunderous. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Durant's angular handwriting. "Midnight, the fox will run free. Keep the diamonds ready. The debt must be paid." Tommy let out a low whistle. So Durant was blackmailing him. Sir Reginald's face turned the colour of old parchment. He came to me months ago, threatened to expose my gambling debts. I paid what I could, but he wanted more. He said he'd sell something that would ruin us all." "And what did he mean by the fox?" Tuppence asked. Reginald shook his head weakly. "I don't know. Perhaps a code, or a name." Randolph, standing near the decanter, spoke softly. "Or perhaps someone in this house." The words hung there, heavy as the storm pressing against the windows. Tuppence closed the safe gently. "So we have a thief, a blackmailer, and now an attempted poisoner. One of you," she said, turning to the room, "is the fox, and whoever it is, they're still running." Lightning flared, throwing every face into stark relief. Fear, guilt, calculation. The downpour surged again, breaking fully at last, rain lashing the windows. With violent insistence, Tommy handed Tuppence a dry towel from the sideboard. "You do realize," he said lightly, "that you're terrifying them all." "Good," she replied. "Fear makes people talk." She looked down at the unconscious butler, breathing shallowly on the sofa. "And he's already told us where to start." Lady Langley's voice trembled. "You mean the safe?" "I mean the portrait," Tuppence said. "It was moved recently, not to hide the safe, but to use it. Someone wanted access, and someone else wanted to keep that access secret." Tommy gave a slow nod. "Two foxes, perhaps. One caught in the other's trap." A low rumble of thunder underscored his words. Tuppence surveyed the uneasy assembly one final time. "Until morning," she said, "no one leaves this house. The game we began tonight isn't over." Sir Reginald's protest was feeble. "Surely the police—" "Will arrive in due course," she interrupted. "But for now, we are the witnesses. And the truth, I assure you, is impatient to be found." As she spoke, the lightning flared again, a brief, merciless glare illuminating the grand portrait above the fireplace. For an instant, the painted woman's eyes seemed almost alive, gleaming with secret knowledge. Tommy followed her gaze and gave a low chuckle. "I dare say your Duchess costume suits you rather well, Tuppence. You command obedience magnificently." She smiled thinly. "A Duchess can command all she likes, dear boy, but it's the fox who decides when to run." The wind howled against the panes, shaking the manor to its bones. Somewhere deep in the house a door creaked shut on its own, and in that sound Tuppence heard it clearly, the soft, mocking echo of the hunt beginning again. Sometime between the constable's rounds and the guest's confinement, the missing diamonds had been quietly returned, not to the display case, but to the hidden safe itself. Back in the library a short while later, the safe door yawned open like a secret that had waited too long to be confessed. The faint smell of iron and dust mingled with the lingering perfume of Lady Langley's rosewater, turning the air strangely heavy. Inside, the contents gleamed under the flicker of the nearest candle, a velvet box, its lid slightly ajar, and beside it, a thick envelope sealed in red wax. Tuppence reached in with steady hands, though her eyes betrayed quick curiosity. "The Langley diamonds," she murmured, lifting the box. Inside, the famous necklace lay coiled like a sleeping serpent, its fire dim but dangerous in the wavering light. Found again, and far too conveniently. Tommy peered over her shoulder. So the missing jewels have been hiding right under their owner's nose. Hardly imaginative. "Or precisely imaginative enough," she replied. "Thieves rarely return their loot, unless they need to prove innocence or misdirect suspicion." She turned to the envelope, breaking the wax with a fingernail. A glossy photograph slid out. For a heartbeat, she simply stared. Then, in a voice stripped of surprise but full of irony, she said, "Well, well, the late Victor Durant had a talent for drama even in absentia." Tommy leaned closer. "Good heavens. Lady Langley?" "In all her finery," Tuppence said. The photograph showed Lady Langley in a Riviera gown of shimmering satin, Durant's arm possessively around her shoulders. Both looked toward the camera, smiling, she nervously, he with triumph. Tommy gave a low whistle. "That explains a great many things." "It explains very little," Tuppence countered. "Too neat, too theatrical. The pose, the timing, it feels staged, as though placed here to ensure we'd find it and draw precisely that conclusion." "You mean someone planted both the diamonds and the photograph?" She nodded. "A red herring with diamonds for scales." At that moment, the library door opened, and Randolph Langley, the cousin with nervous hands and a self-important air, drifted in, holding a candle high. His robe, too grand for a mere housecoat, flapped about him like the wings of an anxious bird. "I couldn't stay away," he announced. "You can feel it, can't you? The tension, the energy. This house reeks of guilt." Tommy muttered, "Possibly also of brandy." But Randolph was undeterred. "I've been reading," he continued grandly, "about psychical detection, methods that transcend logic. I happen to possess a gift for mesmerism, inherited from my grandmother. I can sense guilt." Tuppence exchanged a glance with Tommy that was half amusement, half resignation. "And what do you propose, Mr. Langley?" He smiled, eyes bright with self-delusion. "A séance, to unmask the killer. The dead, you see, have a way of whispering to those attuned to listen." Tommy sighed. "If they whisper anything, I hope it's in plain English." By the time Randolph had assembled the guests, the storm had settled into a steady, relentless rain. The air, however, was no less charged. A circle of chairs surrounded the mahogany table, candles flickering in the draught. Lady Langley, pale but composed, sat stiffly at one end, clutching a handkerchief as though it were a life vest. Sir Reginald stood behind her, looking as though he'd rather face a firing squad. The actress reclined dramatically, delighted by the scene. Even the bishop had been persuaded to attend, though he muttered about the perils of dabbling in unchristian nonsense. Randolph took his place at the head of the table. "We must all clasp hands," he intoned. "No one breaks the circle. The spirit world demands decorum." Tuppence, seated between Tommy and Lady Langley, regarded him coolly. "Let's hope the spirit world is patient with melodrama." "Silence, please." Randolph closed his eyes. "Victor Durant, if your spirit lingers among us, give us a sign." The candles guttered in the breeze. The actress gasped softly. Elkins, revived but still pale, lay propped on a settee under the house doctor's eye, watching with grim skepticism. Randolph's voice deepened. "Reveal the guilty soul. Speak through me." There was a long pause. Then, rather anticlimactically, the bishop sneezed. Tommy murmured, "I rather think that was the spirit of hay fever." Tuppence bit back a smile. But just as the farce seemed complete, a sharp cry rang out. The maid, the nervous one from the kitchen, had sprung to her feet, her hands over her face. "No more," she sobbed. "I can't bear it." Randolph blinked, flustered. I was just beginning to commune." "She's communing just fine," said Tuppence, rising swiftly. "Let the girl speak." The maid's tears streaked down her cheeks. "I saw someone," she choked out. "That night, after the lights went out. I didn't mean to spy. I was only bringing the candles." "Go on," said Tuppence gently. "There was a light, a lantern, moving along the corridor, toward the library. I thought it was Mr. Elkins, but then I saw—" She hesitated, trembling. "I saw boots, tall ones, like a soldier's." Tommy straightened. "A soldier?" "Yes, sir. Shiny black boots. And the person carried something heavy. When they came back, the lantern was dim, and they were wiping their hands." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Randolph clutched his head theatrically. The spirits speak through her. The vision of guilt. Tuppence ignored him. "And you're certain of what you saw?" she asked the maid. The girl nodded miserably. "I swear it, miss, but when the lights came on, the boots were gone." Later, once the séance had dissolved into murmured speculation and refilled glasses, Tuppence and Tommy slipped back into the quiet hall. "Well," Tommy said, "we've learned that Randolph Langley has a future in provincial theatre, and that someone in military footwear took a midnight stroll." "Not just any someone," said Tuppence. "We've met one man here fond of uniforms, Major Cavendish." Tommy's brows rose. "The fellow dressed as a cavalry officer at the Masquerade? The one who tried to teach me fencing with a breadstick?" "The same," she said. "Charming, athletic, and conveniently unaccounted for during the blackout." They walked together toward the staircase, their footsteps soft on the carpet. Tuppence continued. "Lady Langley claimed she went to the terrace for air. Randolph trailed after her. The actress was in the dining room. Sir Reginald was in his study. The bishop was asleep and the butler fetching candles. That leaves only Major Cavendish, missing entirely until the lights came back." Tommy frowned. "But what connects him to Durant? They barely knew each other." "Perhaps not," she said, "but Durant's reach was long. A blackmailer collects secrets the way a miser collects coins. Cavendish might have been one of his debtors." Tommy looked unconvinced. "He seems too proud to be caught by a blackmailer." "Pride and desperation," Tuppence said softly, "make curious bedfellows." They found Major Cavendish in the smoking room, standing by the fire with a drink and the unconcerned air of a man used to admiration. His fair hair gleamed under the lamp. His smile was easy, his eyes alert. "Tuppence," he said warmly, "you look positively radiant considering the circumstances. I was just thinking how these dreadful events will ruin Lady Langley's reputation. Quite tragic." "Indeed," said Tuppence, taking a seat opposite him. "And yet, one might say her reputation was already somewhat precarious." He raised an eyebrow. "Ah, the photograph, I suppose. Poor woman. Durant was a cad. Always knew how to ensnare the vulnerable." Tuppence studied him. "You speak as though from experience." He laughed lightly. "Hardly. Durant and I crossed paths once in Cairo years ago. I found him distasteful. Too clever by half." "Clever men often end up dead," she said, "and sometimes those who despise them end up too close to the scene." He smiled again, but his hand tightened imperceptibly on his glass. "You suspect me, Mrs. Beresford?" "I observe you," she said. "Which is more flattering." Tommy added casually, "You left the ballroom during the blackout." Cavendish's gaze flicked toward him. "Did I? I must have. I recall fetching a coat for Lady Langley from the cloakroom. She was chilled, poor dear." Tuppence tilted her head. "How gallant. Though I wonder why you needed a lantern to do it." For a heartbeat, silence. Then Cavendish chuckled. "My dear Mrs. Beresford, do you imagine I stalked the corridors by gaslight? I assure you I wasn't carrying any lantern." Tuppence's smile was faint. "Perhaps not. Perhaps someone merely wore your boots." He laughed again, but too easily. "You have quite the imagination." "Always," she said. "It's how I notice when someone else runs out of theirs." Later, in their shared room, Tommy watched as Tuppence paced. "So, what's your verdict on our gallant major?" "Guilty," she said. Of charm at least, but possibly of more. The maid's description fits too neatly: boots, lantern, secrecy, and there's one detail that doesn't fit anyone else. What's that? The poison, the butler's water glass. Cavendish poured it. Tommy blinked. You saw that? I did. He brought the tray after insisting the servants rest. He's clever enough to appear helpful, clever enough to remove a talkative witness before dawn. Tommy exhaled. So he's our fox. Perhaps, Tuppence said, gazing toward the window where the storm clouds were parting. But foxes are rarely caught in the open. They burrow deep, beneath lies, beneath sympathy, even beneath chivalry. She smiled faintly. Tomorrow, we dig. The first hint of dawn brushed the sky, pale and cautious. Somewhere in the house the clock began its slow chime, the echo of a long night's secrets counting down to morning. The ballroom at Langley Grange had seen its share of laughter, waltzes, and whispered flirtations, but never before had it hosted a gathering quite like this. The once glittering chandeliers now burned low, their light flickering over anxious faces and half-forgotten masks. Chairs had been drawn into a loose semicircle around the polished dance floor. In the centre stood Tuppence Beresford, poised as if about to take her cue in a play she had written herself. Tommy leaned against a column near the door, nursing his shoulder from an earlier scuffle with a recalcitrant lock, and watching her with fond exasperation. He knew that look, the gleam in her eye that meant the case was about to crack open like a particularly stubborn walnut. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tuppence began, her voice calm but commanding, "thank you for indulging one final performance. Tonight's masquerade began in laughter and ended in tragedy, but I believe we can conclude it with truth, if not quite applause." A murmur rippled through the guests. Lady Langley clutched her niece's hand tightly. Randolph adjusted his cuffs with theatrical nervousness, and Major Cavendish, impeccable in his evening dress, his expression unreadable, lounged against the mantelpiece with a faint smile. Sir Reginald scowled. "Is this really necessary, Mrs. Beresford? Haven't we suffered enough theatrics for one night?" Tuppence met his gaze evenly. "On the contrary, Sir Reginald, theatrics are the only language this house seems to understand." She took a few steps forward, her heels clicking lightly on the marble. "Let's recall what we know. Victor Durant, masquerading as a harlequin, arrived at this party under false pretenses. He was not invited, yet he carried with him two things, a photograph and a plan. The photograph we have all now seen, Lady Langley in a compromising pose with Durant himself. Forgive me, Lady Langley, but it's essential to the truth." Lady Langley's voice trembled. "He said he would destroy it, if I paid him." "Indeed," Tuppence said gently. Durant was a blackmailer, but not a subtle one. He had planned to corner his victim here amid masks and distractions, confident no one would notice the play within the play. But someone else did notice, someone for whom that photograph was more than a scandal. It was a threat to everything he wanted. Her eyes shifted, almost lazily, toward Major Cavendish. He smiled, unfazed. "Surely you don't mean me, Mrs. Beresford. I hardly knew the man." "You knew enough," Tuppence said, "and you had more to lose than anyone else. You're engaged, secretly, to Miss Eleanor Langley, are you not?" The room went still. Lady Langley gasped. The girl in question turned crimson. Cavendish's smile flickered. "Really, Mrs. Beresford?" "Oh, it's quite understandable," Tuppence interrupted smoothly. "You were waiting until her inheritance became official. Sir Reginald's health isn't what it was, and once Eleanor married you, her fortune would secure your debts. But a scandal involving her aunt, or the family name, would have ruined everything." Tommy straightened, watching the Major's jaw tighten. Tuppence continued, her tone precise but almost conversational. "So, when Durant threatened Lady Langley, you saw your future disintegrate. You tried to reason with him, but Durant was not the reasoning kind. He taunted you, perhaps even showed you the photograph, and when the lights went out, you saw your opportunity." Randolph gave a nervous laugh. "Really, this is absurd." "No," Tuppence said softly. "It's methodical. The fox-headed dagger that killed Durant wasn't exotic at all. It came from the Langley collection in the library, which you borrowed during the blackout. A harmless prop, until it wasn't. Cavendish's smile thinned. "You flatter me. I'd hardly be so careless as to murder someone with my own prop." Tuppence nodded. "Careless? Perhaps not. Desperate, certainly. You met Durant in the orangery under the pretence of a truce. He mocked you. He always mocked those beneath his cleverness. You struck him, quick and quiet, intending only to silence him. But the dagger slipped through ribs instead of pride. When the lights returned, you had only minutes to act. You hid the diamonds, which Durant had stolen from the safe to leverage his blackmail, and fled, discarding your glove in the rush. Clever, except you left behind the scent of gunpowder and the trace of your initials, R.L. You thought that would misdirect suspicion towards Sir Reginald." Sir Reginald bristled. "Good heavens," Tuppence went on, her voice unhurried but lethal. "You then carried the jewels back to the library later, placing them in the safe to make it appear as though the theft was unrelated. The photograph? Oh, that was your masterstroke. You knew the sight of Lady Langley's shame would divert attention entirely, and it did, for a while." The silence that followed was dense and electric. Even the candles seemed to hesitate. Cavendish chuckled softly. "Brilliant deduction, Mrs. Beresford. Entirely wrong, of course. You've woven quite the melodrama, but you've no proof. A glove, a dagger, circumstantial, all of it." Tuppence smiled faintly. "You're quite right, which is why I prefer demonstration to accusation." She turned toward Tommy. "The fox, darling." Tommy, whose shoulder had begun to ache again, stepped forward with an expression of long-suffering martyrdom and handed her a small folded handkerchief. Inside lay the fox-headed dagger, gleaming even under the dim light. "This," Tuppence said, lifting it delicately from its evidence bag, "was removed from Durant's wound earlier this morning, polished clean, except for one thing." She gestured to Tommy, who, with mild theatricality, produced a small glass slide. "A fingerprint, faint but distinct, left on the hilt's underside, where you gripped it when pulling it free. The constable will confirm it shortly, but I thought you might like to confess before the applause begins." Cavendish's composure wavered at last. His eyes darted toward the door, calculating. "You overestimate your proof," he said, his voice taut. "Anyone could have touched it." Tuppence tilted her head. "Ah, but not everyone fits the rest of the picture, Major. Not everyone was unaccounted for during the blackout. Not everyone owned those boots the maid saw. And not everyone poured the butler's water last night." The ripple of shock through the guests was almost audible. Cavendish's smile vanished. "You've no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, I think I have," she said softly. "You poisoned him, didn't you? Not to kill, you're too much a coward for that, but to keep him from repeating what he saw. He'd glimpsed you returning from the orangery with a lantern. You couldn't risk his honesty." Randolph gasped. Lady Langley covered her mouth. The bishop muttered a prayer for restraint. Cavendish's hand went instinctively to his pocket, a gesture Tuppence did not miss. "Don't," Tommy said sharply. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. Then Cavendish's posture shifted, shoulders coiling, eyes darting toward the open terrace doors. Tuppence sighed. "And there it is, the flight of the fox." Cavendish bolted. Chairs clattered. Lady Langley screamed. Randolph tripped over the bishop's robes. Cavendish's boots struck the marble as he bolted into the rain-slick night now easing toward dawn. Tommy lunged after him, his earlier injury protesting. "Blast the man's athleticism!" Cavendish made it halfway across the terrace before Tommy caught his coat collar. The two men went down hard, sliding across the rain-slicked stone. A statue of some long-dead ancestor looked on with impassive disapproval as they wrestled. "Confess!" Tommy barked, pinning him down. "Get off me, you meddling fool!" Cavendish hissed, swinging a wild punch that grazed Tommy's cheek. Tommy winced, then retaliated with a move any Hendon instructor would have admired. One knee, one twist, and the Major's advantage vanished. Cavendish lay face down, spluttering, his cufflinks glittering in defeat. By the time Tuppence arrived, accompanied by a very flustered constable, the scene resembled a tableau of exhausted heroism. "Well," she said cheerfully, surveying Tommy's dishevelled state, "that was impressive, if somewhat undignified." He groaned. "You could have mentioned he was trained in the cavalry." "Where would be the fun in that?" The constable cuffed Cavendish, who glared at Tuppence. "You think you've won, Mrs. Beresford," he spat, "but none of it matters. Durant was filth. He deserved what he got. Perhaps, Tuppence said softly, but you don't get to decide justice, Major. Only guilt. And tonight, you've been unmasked. An hour later, the ballroom had quieted again. The guests had retreated to their rooms, the butler was resting under doctor's care, and the constable's motorcar had taken Cavendish away through the dripping gates. Tuppence sat on the edge of the dais, her duchess skirts rumpled, her expression reflective. Tommy limped in, holding 2 cups of tepid coffee. "Victory beverage," he said, handing her one. "Also good for bruises if applied externally." She smiled. "You were magnificent," he grimaced. "I was winded." Magnificently winded, then. They sat in companionable silence. At last Tuppence said, "You know, Tommy, what struck me most wasn't his motive, it was his arrogance. He thought a mask could save him, but masks never hide the eyes. They always betray the truth if you look closely enough." Tommy sipped his coffee. "You should put that on a poster." "Perhaps I shall. Mrs. Beresford detects unmasking made easy," he chuckled, "and I'll play the heroic assistant who ruins his coat tackling villains in the rain." Tuppence's smile softened. "Every detective needs a musketeer, darling." The clock in the hall struck 2, steady and final. She rose, smoothing her gown. "Come along, let's go home. The fox is caught, the diamonds recovered, and I've had quite enough masquerading for one lifetime." Tommy followed her toward the door, pausing only to glance back at the empty ballroom. "You know," he said, "it's a pity. It really was a rather good party, up to the murder." Tuppence laughed, bright, irrepressible, the sound of mischief redeemed. "Yes, but the best parties," she said, "always end with unmasking." And with that, the Beresfords left Langley Grange behind. The storm clearing, the first faint glimmer of dawn catching the broken shards of crystal on the floor, like stars finally put back in their proper places. The morning after the masquerade dawned with the weary light of anticlimax, pale, apologetic, and far too honest for a house that had spent the night pretending. By the time Inspector March from Gloucestershire Constabulary arrived, Langley Grange looked like a portrait after its varnish had cracked. The gilt had dulled, the flowers had wilted, and the servants moved about with the solemnity of undertakers. Tuppence Beresford met the inspector in the entrance hall, her notebook in hand, her tone brisk. "You'll find my account quite comprehensive, Inspector. Timings, statements, and the relevant physical evidence, including the dagger, the glove, and the photograph." Inspector March, a large man whose moustache appeared to bear the full weight of his career, blinked at her. "So I'm to understand, madam, that you've conducted the investigation yourself?" Tuppence smiled pleasantly. "Only the entertaining parts." Tommy, standing beside her with his arm in a makeshift sling, added dryly, "We left the paperwork for you." The inspector grunted, scanning the first page of Tuppence's notes. "You have a tidy hand, Mrs. Beresford." "I'm very proud of it," she said. "Now, if you'd like to see where the culprit fell, my husband can point the way. He's been intimately acquainted with the floor since about 2 o'clock this morning." Tommy muttered, "It was a strategic tackle." "Of course it was, dear." They led the inspector through the house, now drained of its earlier grandeur. The ballroom, with its discarded masks and trampled ribbons, looked like the aftermath of a dream that had gone slightly sour. The terrace beyond still bore the dark smudge where Cavendish had been caught, and the constable guarding the door looked immensely relieved to see someone else taking over. Inspector March surveyed the scene with the resigned air of a man confronted by human folly for the 1,000th time. "A pity," he said, shaking his head. "An officer. Decorated, too. You'd think war would cure men of rash acts." Tuppence said softly, "War teaches courage, Inspector, not always conscience." He looked at her thoughtfully, as if filing away the remark for future use. By noon the formalities were over. Major Cavendish was safely in custody, the stolen diamonds catalogued, and the household released from its uneasy vigil. Lady Langley thanked Tuppence with frosty grace in the drawing-room. "I suppose," she said, "we owe you rather a great deal." Tuppence inclined her head. "Merely the truth, Lady Langley. It tends to cost less than the alternatives." The older woman's lips twitched in something that might have been amusement. "You've saved my family from disgrace, and my niece from a terrible mistake. But I fear the scandal cannot be avoided entirely." "Scandals rarely can," Tuppence replied. "They're simply the price we pay for secrets." Lady Langley's gaze softened, if only slightly. "I do hope, Mrs. Beresford, that you and your husband will accept a token of gratitude." Tommy brightened visibly. "If it's monetary," Tuppence cut him off smoothly, "the satisfaction of justice is reward enough." As they left the room, Tommy whispered, "The satisfaction of justice doesn't cover laundry bills. My doublet will never recover." Tuppence smiled, linking her arm through his. "Then let us hope next Halloween's festivities are less ruinous to your wardrobe." The drive back to London was quiet. Autumn's last leaves swirled across the lanes, golden and defiant. Tuppence stared out the window, her mind still half at Langley Grange, the echo of the Masquerade lingering like perfume. Tommy glanced sideways at her. "You're thinking," he said. "It's that look you get, like a cat watching a clockwork mouse." "I'm always thinking," she said. "You should try it sometime." He grinned. "I think you enjoy these escapades too much." "Don't be absurd," she said primly. Then, after a pause, "Well, perhaps a little. There's something irresistible about people in masks. They believe disguise protects them, when in truth it only reveals who they are." Tommy chuckled. "I'd say Major Cavendish learnt that the hard way." Indeed, the fox always thinks himself cleverer than the hounds, until the hunt catches up. The car hummed along the wet road, the countryside giving way to the sprawl of London. That evening their flat in South Kensington welcomed them with the quiet domesticity that Langley Grange had sorely lacked. The fire glowed cheerfully, the kettle sang, and the faint aroma of cocoa drifted through the sitting room. Tuppence, now in her dressing gown, was curled up on the sofa with a satisfied air. Tommy, still lamenting his costume, stood before the mirror, examining a tragic rent along the sleeve. "Look at this," he said mournfully. "A hero's uniform reduced to rags, a casualty of detection." "You could frame it," Tuppence suggested. "Title it The Fall of the Musketeer. Very modern." He frowned at her reflection. "You realize, don't you, that every time we attend a social event, it ends in murder? We're developing quite the reputation." "Reputation is merely experience with a bad press," she said serenely, pouring cocoa into 2 cups. "Besides, where would the fun be if every party was safe?" Tommy took the cup she offered, raising it in mock salute. "To domestic tranquility, and may it last longer than 24 hours. Tuppence clinked her cup against his. "To curiosity, the one vice I refuse to give up." He laughed, sinking into the armchair opposite her. "You'll be the death of me, Tuppence." "Possibly," she said lightly, "but you'll die entertained." They sat in comfortable silence, the clock ticking softly between them. The night outside was still, London wrapped in its hum of distance, buses, voices, the life of the city carrying on unaware of masquerades or daggers. Tuppence leaned back, watching the firelight dance across the room. "Do you know what I've decided, Tommy?" He groaned. "That we're taking up knitting instead of crime." "Hardly. I've decided that next Halloween we'll stay home. No parties, no riddles, no corpses." "Splendid idea," he said instantly. "I might even survive that one." "But," she added dreamily, "if another mystery were to knock on our door, something truly irresistible." He sat up. "Tuppence, no." "Then," she continued, ignoring him, "we'd be obliged to answer. After all, beneath every mask some truth waits to be unmasked, and you know I can't resist lifting the veil." Tommy sighed, setting down his cup. "And there," he said, "goes my peaceful retirement." She smiled over her cocoa, eyes glinting with the same mischievous spark that had carried them through more than one improbable adventure. "Nonsense," she said softly. "You wouldn't have it any other way." The fire crackled in agreement. Outside, a distant church bell struck 9, and somewhere in the city's tangle of rooftops and alleyways, another story waited, quietly preparing its disguise.